Now that you have your gauge, you may have found that the gauge you want doesn't match what's called for in the pattern. In this lesson, we're going to talk about using another size of the pattern, basic grading using ratios, and deciding the yardage needed if you make those adjustments. A quick way to adjust a pattern based on your gauge is to simply use a different size of a pattern. You'll want to estimate the number of stitches around by multiplying the measurement of your desired size by the gauge called for in the pattern. Let's go back to our 44-inch sweater. If you want to make the 44-inch size and the gauge that's called for in the pattern is 5 stitches to the inch, then that means that if we multiply gauge times inches around, we're going to get 220 stitches around. And when you get that measurement, what you'll want to do is you'll want to make that analysis for every size of the pattern. And what that gives you is the estimated number of stitches for every size of the pattern at 5 stitches per inch. Now let's say that the gauge you want to make this sweater out of is 5.5 stitches per inch. There are 2 calculations needed. The first is, how many stitches around do you need for 5.5 stitches to equal your 44 inches? And 5.5 times 44 equals 242. The next thing would be to look at all those measurements, all those other sizes that you analyzed, and see if one of the sizes estimates out to about 240 stitches per inch. If you have in your pattern a size 48, then you're in luck, because 48 inches times 5, the gauge called for in the pattern, means that the size 48 was written for a number of stitches of 240. That's very close to 242. And so if you made the size 48 with your smaller yarn at 5.5 stitches per inch, then you would end up with, if we divide 240 by 5.5, you'd end up with a 43.6 inch sweater, which is very nearly 44 inches. This kind of calculation can be used with any kind of garment because measurement times gauge always equals a number of stitches. This is actually a fun way to better understand how patterns and design work and to bump up your own creativity. Pattern grading is the scaling of a pattern to a different size by using ratios to determine where the different sizes change dimensions or stitch counts. A ratio is determined by dividing your new stitch gauge that you've developed through swatching and testing your yarn, divided by the original stitch gauge. That equals a stitch ratio. Then when you go back to the pattern, when a number of stitches is specified, multiply the number in the pattern by your stitch ratio. That equals a new number of stitches. The same applies to row gauge. After you've swatched and tested and measured, take your new row gauge and divide it by the original row gauge, and you have a row ratio. When you go back to the pattern, each time you see a number of rows, multiply that number by the row ratio, and you get a new number of rows. Now, remember, you're still the boss. You still have to be thinking through this process. What you're really doing is creating a new pattern number by number, and you'll have to decide what to do when you encounter fractions and weird numbers. You'll have to decide, do I want to keep the number the same, err on the side of a few more stitches or rows, or fewer stitches or rows? And it's important that you stay on top of the process. But it is an easy way to change your pattern. Let's say that your original stitch gauge as called for by the pattern was 5 stitches per inch, but the stitch gauge you want to use for this pattern is 5.5 stitches per inch. 5.5 divided by 5 equals 1.1. This is the ratio that you will apply to all the numbers of stitches in the pattern. Let's say that your pattern was written for a worsted weight yarn and wanted you to cast on 132 stitches. To change so that you could get the same measurement using a DK weight yarn, you would multiply 132 times 1.1, and that would give you 145. Let's see if we test this, if it will really work. 132, the original cast on, divided by the original gauge, 5, is going to give you a measurement of 26.4. So whatever you would be casting on would be 26.4 inches wide. If you cast on 145 stitches using your new gauge of 5.5 stitches per inch, that DK yarn, you would get a measurement of 26.363, almost exactly the same. So using this ratio method, all you would have to remember is that one number and multiply it times every number of stitches in the pattern, and you automatically write a new pattern that works for your gauge. Give it a try. It really does work in real time, as you can see. This little sweater is an old pattern that I wrote years ago for a teddy bear sweater, and it's at a gauge of 4.5 stitches per inch. I didn't cheat, but I swatched a new yarn and got a gauge of 3.5 stitches per inch. And I used the principle of ratios to change all the numbers in this pattern to get this new sweater. And you can see that they are exactly the same size. And so ratios really can work, and I hope that you'll have fun with them. Once you've made changes to your pattern, you'll want to estimate new yardage based on these changes. There are a few quick options for you to try and figure out how many yards of yarn you'll need for your redesigned sweater. You can turn to Ravelry to see what's been used in similar designs and using similar yarns. You can go to apps, and fellow Craftsy instructor Ann Budd has the Knitter's Handy Guide to Yarn Requirements, and there are lots of other resources for you to use to figure out new yardage. In your class materials, I've provided a handout for you to go through one process which can seem fiddly, but it really is used in the industry, and it's called the square inch estimate method. And in order to do the square inch estimate method, you're going to start with a good swatch. You're going to have a swatch that's in your gauge, and it doesn't need to be that big. It just needs to be maybe 4 inches is what we're going to use in the example, and you'll be able to get all the information you need to estimate a new yarn amount from this swatch. So let's look at how the math works. Once you've knit your swatch, you want to measure the swatch and find the square inches, which is length times width. And my swatch was 4 inches, so 4 times 4 is 16. Now this part sounds a little strange, but stay with me. But you're going to unravel the swatch. Then you're going to measure the number of yards used in the swatch. And in mine, it was 14 yards of yarn. The next step is to look at the schematic of your sweater and divide it into 3 rectangles, the body and sleeves. You're going to find the square inches of each rectangle by multiplying the length and the width of each rectangle. You're going to add these together and multiply by 2 for the front and back of the sweater. This is going to be a crazy big number. In this case, it's 1,840. Then you're going to divide this big number by the number of inches in your swatch. 1,840 divided by 16 is 115. And now we get to the finish line. You're going to multiply 115 times the number of yards used in your swatch, which was 14, and that gives us 1,610. And that's a number that looks familiar in terms of yardage. This is a decent estimate of how much yarn you'll need, and you can use it as your starting place for how much yarn to buy or use from your stash. A lot of times you'll have to do this whole process backwards from yarns in your stash, but by using all of the things that we've talked about throughout the whole class, you can find out information about those yarns from your stash, and you can make a positive and confident estimate for how much yarn you'll need. In our next lesson, we're going to talk about making informed yarn decisions. We have gone over a ton of information in this class, but I don't want it to be overwhelming. I want it to point you toward feeling confident. And so in this lesson, we're going to talk about adjusting versus rewriting a pattern, resources for better decision making, and project and pattern inspiration. There's a fine line between yarn substitution and designing an entirely new sweater. And that line, we nudged close to that line when